So welcome everyone again. This webinar covers consumer health clinical trials, best practices for execution and recruitment. So my name is Mary. I'm the co-founder here at Linda's Health. We run radically faster end-to-end clinical trials, including consumer health, and joined by Matt, one of our customers.
Hi, I'm Matt McArthur, and I am the clinical lead at Habitual. We're a UK-based digital health company specializing in type 2 diabetes remission and weight management. And obviously, we've been a customer of Linda's for an ongoing trial.
Thanks. Awesome. And so maybe just a word on us at Linda's Health and how we conduct studies, including the Habitual study. So our general model is to run entire clinical trials. And there's two things that make our approach different. So firstly, our business model, we only ever provide services on a completely fixed fee basis. So if you asked us to run a clinical trial, we would provide a completely fixed cost for everything we're doing. And then that would only become payable once we hit pre-agreed milestones. So we think that's a lot fairer than the typical industry model, which is paying by the hour. And that leaves, kind of your partners with an incentive, maybe not to do things in the most efficient way. And then the second thing that makes us different is, we have all the functions you'd expect from a CRO. So project management, clinical, medical teams, biostatistics, data management, et cetera. But we combine that with a unique technology platform and approach that allows us to set up a study, hit full enrollment, and really just conduct a study much faster. And we'll obviously spend the majority of this time talking through how these approaches can be applied to consumer health studies, with a particular focus, Matt, on the study we ran together with Habitual. So yeah, as I say, we will cover the unique challenges of consumer health trials, how they differ from traditional clinical trials, some of the reasons that consumer health companies would conduct a clinical trial in the first place, general study design considerations, and then specific tactics and approaches to participant recruitment and retention, which are a particular pain point we see come up a lot. If you have experience running kind of a traditional drug therapeutic pharma trial, it obviously differs in a number of ways from a trial that might be fit for purpose for a consumer health company. So firstly, endpoints. With a kind of drug trial, you're often quite limited in the endpoints that a regulator, for instance, might want to see. I use gold standard and inverted commas because those can sometimes be outdated. Whereas with consumer health, you have a lot more kind of creative freedom. Scale, often budgets mean that drug trials can be much larger in the multiple thousands of patients, but sometimes consumer health studies might be more limited in terms of budget, and thus in terms of number of participants. And then, study design. With consumer health trials, it's often important, particularly important, that they be used in a kind of real world setting, which does give you more flexibility around virtual and hybrid approaches. And we can also use those to lower budgets. Yeah, and then, obviously, clinical validation for consumer health products, it's often not 100% required to get your product to market. If it's a consumer health product, you might be able to sell it directly. But nonetheless, there are some important reasons why you might want to undertake clinical validation. And maybe, Matt, I don't know, turn it over to you. Can you say a bit more about Habitual's product, why you chose to undertake the clinical validation route for Habitual?
Sure. I guess for us, we really wanted there was a number of facets, really. We really wanted to obviously show that our product was effective at what we'd planned to do. So essentially, we planned a trial that was based on a previous diabetes remission trial called the Direct trial, which was run in the UK. And we really wanted to show that we could implement the same process of trying to reverse type 2 diabetes by using the Habitual app, and by a slightly evolved process. So for us, there's a number of arms that we really wanted to show. Obviously, that one, that it's effective. To clinical safety, we obviously want to make sure that what we are providing and what we are claiming to be effective and safe is obviously for the patient. Patient safety is paramount for us, regardless if it's consumer health or medication. But even for consumer health, that's really, really important. Obviously, thinking about risk management, if there's anything in particular that we need to iron out or sort of address. So in the terms of adverse events, and really building trust, trust from the consumer that our products are clinically validated, trust from healthcare systems that they could recommend our product or use our product. And the UK, obviously, we're aiming down, hopefully for the NHS, we'd use our product, and other places in, say, the States would be sort of insurers that would be confident that our product would be effective. And then I guess from a startup perspective as well, from an investor trust that our products are effective and are clinically validated. So there's quite a lot of factors that really, that made us really want to go down the consumer health trial route.
Nice. No, thank you. Cool. And yeah, we'll go into a bit more detail about like how the trial was designed and executed shortly. I won't dwell on it, but obviously, with a lot of competition in the market, a lot of frankly lower quality solutions, differentiating yourself using clinical evidence is more important than ever. And you spoke to this point around kind of risk management, and we'll talk about this later. But what I think is particularly interesting with Habitual's product is that you do have like a kind of therapeutic, or you can show a sort of therapeutic level benefit. And also it kind of interfaces closely with medication a participant might be taking or a consumer might be taking. And so this sort of risk management point is particularly important. And yeah, we touched on this point around market differentiation. And then I think also just on this market differentiation point, this is something that maybe we see a lot in our daily lives. And this definitely resonates with me. It feels like there's never been so many different kind of health solutions for something, be it traditional oral drugs or sort of drug products, oral supplements, or even kind of lifestyle interventions, digital products. And I think as a consumer, you can see this from some of the kind of published research on this, consumers really struggle to differentiate them and are relying on those kind of markers of clinical efficacy. And they're really becoming like more sophisticated in how they sort of, interface with products. But yeah, maybe pivoting a bit to some of the unique challenges of consumer health trials. We think a lot about like what makes consumer health trials different from traditional drug therapeutic trials. I mean, firstly, you have challenges around enrollment. There might, participants, that same skepticism might carry over to participants where they might be skeptical that the product works and they might think that they could get access to similar products already. There's definitely a point around inclusion and representativeness of your sample. And Matt, you mentioned running these trials to make the data relevant to payers like the NHS, to US payers. They're particularly concerned with how representative the patient population is. Of course, consumers are always concerned about data privacy. And then, there tends to be just a smaller budget for these types of trials than like more of a therapeutic trial. And yeah, I mean, maybe thinking about some of these challenges in the context of Digest, the trial that we ran together. I mean, Matt, maybe turn it over to you. Are you able to talk through a little bit about how the trial was designed, how it ran, and we can kind of touch on some of these points?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, from the trial design perspective, we really sort of, when we were looking at our endpoints or what we were wanting to achieve, we really sort of used the same endpoints and that had been used in the direct trial. So, what we were really looking at is weight change and reduction in HbA1c, waist circumference, and reduction in systolic blood pressure. And so whenever we were thinking about our design, as I said, we sort of used that as our primary endpoints, and obviously we had a number of other secondary endpoints as well. But we wanted to show essentially that the sort of process of type 2 diabetes remission could be achieved by using an app and by not sort of in-person input. And as I said, from the use of Lindus, we were able to use a fully sort of decentralized model. They used they approached a few different routes. They used some primary care centers to basically sign up for the study, and that was a sort of a primary route. They also went down the social media route and a few other sort of different advertising campaigns to reach different communities and to get a diverse group. But from a trial perspective, Linda's really handled most of this for us, and were really, really helpful and effective for that.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, I mean, something that I think is really interesting about this study is we do run a lot of drug therapeutic studies in metabolic health and type 2 diabetes. And essentially, the endpoints for this study were basically identical to the endpoints for phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 studies we run for drug products, HbA1c, BMI. Yeah. And I think it was interesting to be able to run a study ultimately in a consumer health non-drug product, but with, frankly, an identical level of sort of rigor that we normally take to like a drug product study. and also with a really similar way of recruiting patients. So, because it had very strict eligibility criteria, as you say, we took a kind of multi-pronged approach looking at primary care, so getting primary care physicians to directly refer patients. But we also supplemented that with social media because we never want to be too reliant on one channel. And we did the study in a decentralized way. Now, we might not use a decentralized model for a drug study, but this is how we were able to do the study with, frankly, an identical level of rigor, but just faster and a lot more cost effectively.
Yeah, I think that was, from a secondary endpoint as well. We were obviously looking at the patient satisfaction and how the patients thought of it as well. And I think for them, having that decentralized model was perhaps more attractive. And I guess what we hoped is that the sort of adherence and sticking to the trial would be people would be more engaged with this. So yeah, I think it was hopefully when the full results come out later in the year, we'll be able to have some pretty impressive data.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, one of the coolest things for us was we solicited just like open-ended feedback from participants, both as part of the protocol and like as a general matter, of course, and was seeing some of the awesome participant feedback we had from people who had used the product. They'd felt a kind of real measurable change because they could see their weight, their HbA1c. But just being able to hear from those participant voices directly during the trial was at least like super rewarding.
And I think from the patients as well, some of the secondary endpoints our sort of aim was to reduce medication that people are needing to use. So we're hoping to reduce the number of glucose lowering medications that are needed. So that's our overall one of our secondary endpoints as well. So I think from a patient perspective, the less medication that they need in the long run is really, really a positive aspect as well. So I think it's when these sort of trials are have the potential to cause positive change for patients, then hopefully that would drive engagement as well.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, I mean, we've touched a little bit on this already, but the kind of trial model, how did you mention that the study design, you were kind of using the direct trial as a sort of model, but you also mentioned some of the endpoints. I guess, can you say a bit more about how you selected these endpoints, or really how the direct trial selected these endpoints, and then also about the kind of remote or virtual study visits and what gave you confidence that was the right approach?
Yeah, our overall aim was for type 2 diabetes remission. And obviously that's when how we sort of went down the sort of route of looking at HbA1c. Now, obviously with type 2 diabetes, we know that sort of the driver for this is sort of either overweight or obesity. So we know that by achieving weight loss, you should, in theory, get subsequent reduction in HbA1c and aiming for the sort of reversal of type 2 diabetes. Same with, I guess, waist circumference, that sort of newer guidance and thought processes is that, a BMI on its own isn't truly as effective and isn't representative for all groups. So sort of using a combination of these factors can really be quite useful at looking at a patient's metabolic and cardiovascular health. Same with systolic blood pressure. And in our program, we aim to we give advice to the primary care clinicians about stopping and sort of how we would taper and wean medications. And that's how that's, I guess, why we're looking at systolic blood pressure as well. So all the sort of endpoints that we were sort of looking at were really trying to show beneficial outcomes for a patient's cardiovascular metabolic health. So we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel with any sort of showing any sort of new outcomes, but really trying to prove that our product can be very effective in achieving these.
Yeah, makes sense. And actually, something else I wanted to touch on was we talked about endpoints, but also like the endpoints kind of giving it that clinical rigor, but also like who you were able to work with in terms of key opinion leaders. Are you able to say kind of a bit more about that? And I guess Professor Leroux's involvement?
Yeah, so from the outset, I guess from part of our trying to make sure that our results in our trials are as clinically validated as possible, we sought the advice we looked at various people who we thought might be able to give us the best sort of advice on what endpoints we wanted to get and how we wanted to run the trial. And Professor LaRue was very helpful in guiding us. He's a sort of world-renowned expert in the field, and he was very, very useful. And I guess that was part of made the process a lot easier for us as well, that his very generous involvement in that.
Yeah, and something else that we've seen that we didn't actually use as much in this study, but can be useful, is this kind of creative freedom when it comes to endpoints. So here it was a pretty straightforward decision to stick with these, HbA1c, certain quality of life measures. But in other consumer health studies, we've been able to integrate data from wearables, data from kind of other more sort of custom surveys, and even things like, photos or videos submitted directly by participants, and using that as a form of source, which has been really valuable. Yeah, another big challenge we touched on slightly is patient recruitment, and patient recruitment is kind of a perennial challenge when it comes to clinical studies, be they for drug studies or for consumer health. But I think in a consumer health context, there are some kind of strategies that are particularly effective. And I'll just sort of touch on these, but Matt, feel free to jump in with your thoughts as it pertains to the digest study as well. I mean, so first, digital marketing, this is generally like the most cost effective, but it is easy to get wrong, I would say. So obviously with something like Facebook advertising, you have access to a huge pool of patients in any geography, technically. However, there's risk that you could be targeting ineligible patients, or like kind of spam patients or something, or spam participants. And so what we do is combine a kind of digital marketing approach with very like real-time feedback about the kind of patients that are then going down a pre-screener and enrolling in a study. And we also have automatic tools around, looking at the IP address of these patients, geo-targeting, targeting by different demographic profiles that can really narrow that effort down and ensure that we're only enrolling the right participants. I think also kind of unique to us is these, healthcare collaborations. So we have the ability to screen and recruit participants within like a primary care setting. And this is what we talked about. This is kind of what we did for this study. So literally, screening stacks of millions of electronic health records, and then reaching out to those participants who appear to be eligible based on, what's on their EHR and the eligibility criteria, and then kind of enrolling them in the study. And then, we've also used kind of partnerships with community groups, be they kind of rare disease patient charities, or even charities like the Diabetes Foundation in the US, places like that make these study opportunities available to their members. And I guess I'll shut up in a second, but I think what's really interesting about this is I would say that like finding the participants is the easy part, and that goes for whether we're talking about a very broad population in consumer health or a more narrow population like this, or even we've recruited patients in rare diseases. The hard part is the whole journey from finding that patient to actually enrolling in the study and making sure that is as smooth as possible. But yeah, and that's kind of what we focus most of our effort on. But I don't know, Matt, would let you come in with any comments about how this worked with the digest study, or any other reflections you have from your broader research.
Yeah, I think being able to offer a fully decentralized model really helps. And I think with people's lives, how busy they are, and involvements with work and general life, makes participating in a trial perhaps not top of their priority list. So I think being able to offer that, the decentralized model, really, really helped. And I think, looking at previous trials in type 2 diabetes remission as well, especially, which were particularly in-person trials, they had one in the UK, and I think they only really achieved about 16% attendance. And I think the patient feedback from that was the process of having to go into the clinics and regularly inpatient and in-person attendance really drove down that attendance for the patient. So I think for us, being able to have that process was quite effective. I think really from an enrollment perspective, I think going for a multi-pronged approach was effective. And I think, as I said, the way Lindis achieved this was, obviously, you always have to think about the sort of data privacy and sort of data sharing. But as I said, I think from what you were saying, that setting up the sites as research sites and processing the patient's data in the way that we would normally do in, say, secondary care or an MDT for, say, suitability for a certain treatment, then I think that we were able to sort of make sure that we're adhering to all the GDPR kind of processes. So I think all the patients, they seem to appreciate that approach. And as I said, from our perspective, we really didn't have to worry too much about that. And you guys at Linda seem to handle it expertly, so it was really useful.
Cool. No, thanks. And all credit to our study team there. Yeah, you mentioned a bit of this in your answer just now. I can maybe comment on this a bit. I definitely agree with you that for consumer health studies in general and in populations, in type 2 diabetes, these more kind of chronic conditions, retention, sort of patient engagement, retention, adherence can be a real challenge. I totally agree that running the study remotely or using hybrid visits makes a big difference there. And actually something that we've seen on both our US and European studies, kind of regardless, is particularly and we've published research on this with the University of Oxford, particularly participants from kind of diverse backgrounds tend to be particularly sensitive to time demands and effort required to partake in clinical trials. And the reason is that they also, they tend to have shift work or sort of jobs where they can't just take an afternoon off or that will directly affect, their wages, which I think is totally understandable. And so in the context of encouraging a kind of diverse representative sample, just paying really close attention to some of these study design questions is super important. But something else, we can do with our platform is obviously really easy ePro questionnaires that are delivered as a web app to a participant's device. So it works on, virtually any device, and there's no need for a participant to kind of download a separate app, which they tend not to like, but it's just as secure as a full app. We send them automatic text message reminders up to a visit or a survey. And if they miss a visit or a survey, they'll get automatic reminders as well. We can do custom reimbursement per participant. So we could say what we normally do is have a payment for each visit attended or even each survey provided. And we've used this on consumer health studies where daily diaries have been a feature, and we've been able to achieve adherence for daily diaries above 95% just by tying them to micropayments, which has been very useful. And then, Matt, you mentioned this a bit as well, making sure the trial fits around a participant's life. I totally agree. That's really important, to the point we made around participants who have more demanding jobs or jobs where they're paid by the hour. Something we found really useful is on that onboarding call, asking the participant about their daily schedule, and then really making sure we fit the visits or the surveys around that schedule. Yeah. And then there's also just no substitute for having that kind of remote support from coordinators, from nurses who are checking in with participants regularly if they notice there's been an issue.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, isn't it? I think, for a lot of health conditions, there will be a correlation with them, with the demographic and deprivation. And, I think you have to look at that and you have to think about the disease or the condition that you are trying to assess. And I think particularly with the likes of type 2 diabetes, there are links and there are correlations with sort of more deprived population and higher levels of obesity, which will subsequently lead to higher levels of type 2 diabetes. And I think that all those considerations have to be taken into account. So yeah, as you say, trying to offer as much flexibility as possible and individualize that rather than sort of having one set approach is really important.
Yeah. I realize we sort of touched on these already. So yeah, just a few final thoughts to close off, and then we'll jump over to Q&A. So we've talked through consumer health clinical studies, are definitely not the same as the more traditional therapeutic studies. They have some advantages, but also have unique challenges around sort of particularly kind of budget, study designs, representativeness. But as long as you're deploying a fit for use model, it's pretty easy to overcome those challenges and actually make them a strength without sacrificing things like clinical validity. And yeah, I mean, we've touched on this as well, but just the kind of importance of the increasing importance really of, providing more validation for consumer health products. Consumers are more savvy than ever. And I mean, Matt, I guess with Habitual, it's partly about consumers, but also about health systems who are really interesting customer. And then finally, some of these challenges, there's generally no one size fits all. And that goes for patient recruitment, where you probably want to deploy multiple channels and also make sure that you're following the whole patient journey from start to finish, as well as, looking at making sure the study design fits around participants' lives as far as possible, rather than the other way around. So yeah, we were obviously really excited to be able to partner with you guys on this study. Really excited about the kind of the final results coming out. But yeah, maybe I'll just, any other final thoughts from you, Matt, before we wrap up?
Yeah, as I said, I think, we're in a constant battle at the moment to fight misinformation that's on the internet and social media about various products. And I think with a lot of consumer health products, there isn't the same regulation with regards to, issuing advertising. So I think, for us, a lot of the battle is to prove that your products are safe, effective, and really doing what you're claiming them to be doing. Because I think there's a lot of unsubstantiated claims out there about various products and various companies, and especially in the health world, where people are a lot more health conscious now and thinking about what they're doing, what they're putting into their bodies, and thinking about their overall health. So I think for us to build trust, as I said, from trust that what we are doing is right, for ourselves, trust for the patient, trust for health systems, and trust for investors, really, and it comes down to, without all those factors, our company will, if everyone has the trust, our company will hopefully flourish with these. And without them, then I think a product or a company may struggle. So that's sort of what we're really trying to achieve from this. So yeah, as I said, hopefully later in the year, once we get the results, we'll be able to show all the hard work.
Yeah, a great point to end on. And yeah, thanks so much. So yeah, I think we just had a couple of questions in the Q&A, but maybe first question was, in what cases will digital marketing recruitment not work? I can maybe start with this, and then Matt, if you want to talk about this in the context of the digest study. But yeah, in our experience, populations that are particularly kind of rare or hard to reach, and that could be because there just aren't many patients who have the condition or have the medical eligibility criteria, or it could be we've done infectious disease studies where you need to recruit participants in a very narrow time window, after they contract or test positive for something or start displaying symptoms. And I think in both of those cases, it can be pretty hard to reach participants via social media. So it's a really rough benchmark, but anything less than, if it's like 1 in 5,000 or 1 in 3,000, that kind of level, it tends to be a bit harder. And that's when we turn to the other channels. So referrals by groups and this kind of EHR screening and referral, which we use together on the digest study. But yeah, Matt, I don't know if you have anything to add there about digital marketing.
Yeah, I guess when it comes down to the condition, doesn't it, and the sort of the demographic that you are wanting to achieve. And obviously with any sort of trial, you want to get the most diverse set of patients possible, which, I think any trial will always struggle with. I would say, thinking about certain conditions, if it's age, slightly older population, sort of digital literacy might not be as good as the younger groups. And also, so as I touched on before, the sort of deprivation, I think a lot of us take it for granted that everyone has computers and everyone has smartphones and everyone has access to this. But actually, there are large portions of our populations that don't have that, and it's not as easily accessible. So I think in those ways that digital marketing might not work. As well, thinking about, as I said, when I talked about the misinformation, a lot of people may see these things and they may not trust the adverts they see online, because there is so much misinformation that it's hard for some people to trust what they read online. So it's a real mix, and I think that's why it's good to have different processes to try and recruit and to market the trials.
Nice, thank you. And yeah, someone asks, can you elaborate a bit more on the ways you try to fit clinical trials into patients' lives rather than vice versa? I think likewise, I can kind of start and then we'll hand over to you, Matt. But I think firstly, if you just take a look at the protocol, and it requires a number of actions from a patient. So maybe a first visit or a first call, and then maybe some remote kind of ePro surveys or study visits. And I think just as far as possible, trying to understand what the patient, on that first engagement, trying to understand what the patient's life and priority is like. So our coordinators usually ask people, firstly, like, this is what you're going to be required to do. Secondly, tell me about your daily life. Do you have certain commitments that you can't move? If you're going to have to do daily surveys, when is a good time to receive them? If you're going to have to come into a study visit once a week, what days are good for you? And then just start with the hard requirements from the patient's life, really, and then try and fit the study around that. We've done other studies in like metabolic health where that isn't really possible because it's something like even this is an example, like an oral glucose tolerance test where they need to have fasted for 12 hours before, and it's only really convenient to do that in the morning, so you stop eating at night. But even then, like, I've seen other protocols and other providers, run studies where they ask people to do OGTTs in the evening, and it's like, well, you're kind of asking someone to fast for the whole day, and that's maybe not the most convenient thing. So yeah, I think just taking the time to really understand what patients do, and then providing stuff in the background like automatic reminders for upcoming visits, really clearly signposting what they need to do when, and then reminding them if they miss something and making it really easy to like rebook a visit are all kind of tactics that work there. And Matt, not sure if there's anything else you could add there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from our trial, it was a fairly fairly involved in patients' lives. As I said, I probably didn't quite touch exactly on what was involved in our digest trial. As I said, it's because the patients were given, a total dietary replacement plan, which was low calorie, consisting of soups and shakes for 6 weeks, and then the sort of reintroduction or sort of a sort of reintroduction of food and diet with education. It was very all encompassing for their lives. And so, the trial didn't fit seamlessly in, I guess, but it was very involved. But I think from the perspective of trying to monitor, it was a lot easier being able to be, that decentralized model rather than having to go in face to face. But as I said, everything was provided for them, and the education was provided digitally as well. So that made it a bit more seamless, rather than having to go in person for these sorts of aspects.
Yeah, great. But yeah, just the next question here. So the person asks, I'm trying to decide if a clinical study is worth doing for my product since we aren't looking for regulatory approval. Are there certain product types or segments where producing clinical data is more meaningful and helping differentiate our product? Super interesting question. And like, this applies to like a lot of the clients we have in consumer health. I don't know, maybe Matt, can you maybe talk about, maybe do you want to start with this one about how you guys decided, or how you at Habitual decided to run the study, even though it wasn't for regulatory approval? And then I can jump in as well. Yeah.
I guess it really depends where you are, where you are in the journey of your product. Are you starting from a new or a novel product? Is this something where there hasn't been any other sort of trials related to that in the past, or what you're really basing it on? For us, I guess this was a recognized plan for type 2 diabetes remission with the total dietary replacement. But we were trying to show our digital product, the effectiveness of it. So yeah, and I guess for us, we didn't necessarily need to, because for any sort of approval, this is a sort of a proven method, and there's proven trials for that and follow-ups from that. But for us, I guess we felt it was really important, from, as I sort of touched on before, from the trust signals, from trying to widen our reach of who we provide our product to. I would say it really depends on how confident you are with your product, from a safety perspective, from a side effect perspective, and where you are in the journey of its development and how it's been used in the past. Because I think it's going to be a fairly saturated market in a lot of aspects, depending on what your product is. So it's really just trying to set yourself apart when it comes to advertising, whether that's on your own sort of websites or social media, being able to show patients that you are trustworthy, that your product is effective. As I said, to help you sleep at night as well. that your product is safe for its purpose, really.
Yeah, I definitely echo all of that. I think with my former investor hat on, the kind of the sort of B2B angle is interesting here. So like and I guess Habitual is an example of this. It's very hard to sell via health providers, insurers, health systems like US insurers, US providers, the NHS, et cetera, without clinical data. Like they will basically all demand clinical data before you can sell your product. And that's something that's one of the more common use cases we see, as well as just this sort of general kind of background, helping consumers see that your product is safe and effective. So yeah, but yeah, great question. And then I think, yeah, we just had one more question on the docket here. And if there are any final questions, please do send them in. Or you can always get in touch with us via the link on the screen, via the QR code, or just email address hello@Lindis Health. Any one of those will work with any other questions or sort of comments. But yeah, the last question we had here is just, so someone asks, when planning a study in consumer health, how do I think about designing the study to both collect the data I want, but also to ensure it is practical to run and recruit for? Another great question. And broadly in clinical trials, people are really guilty of not getting this right. And classic thing we see in some of the drug studies is it's, a clinical trial that's almost been designed in a vacuum without thinking about how patients will actually interact with the trial. So, yeah, so I think same thing goes here, is just understanding like you literally have a budget for your clinical trial in terms of financials, and the more endpoints you add, the more expensive the trial is going to be, because it just costs money to collect data. But I would also think about like a budget in terms of participants' time and burden. I think this point is like particularly important with consumer health trials, where maybe you're dealing with healthier participants, or their just psychology is they're not like, they don't have necessarily a disease or a health condition. And your ability, their kind of tolerance to do lots of steps is lower. And so we think about it in terms of the budget of what you can get a participant to do or what they will reasonably do. And I think that can be quite useful. So like an example is we were asked to run a consumer health study that had something like 12 questionnaires back to back. And we sort of, sure, those might all generate interesting data, but if you ask someone to sit down and fill out questionnaires for 45 minutes, every week, they probably just get fed up and leave unless you're paying them a lot of money. And we kind of fed that back and pared it down to a shorter list that had, 80% of the data that the sponsor wanted, but was, only a fraction as burdensome and also cost less money too. So I think, yeah, just thinking about those trade-offs. And then also on your question mentions recruitment. We have the ability, given a set of eligibility criteria, we can show you precisely how many patients in our primary care network meet those eligibility criteria. And we know from our social media efforts how quickly we can recruit those patients via social media as well. So we can literally just show you with a pretty high degree of accuracy, here's how long it'll take to recruit the patients, here's exactly how much it'll cost. And then that can give you the kind of ammo to decide. So yeah, which, make it a bit more concrete.
I think you're right, isn't it? It's about having open dialogue with your trial team and being open to suggestions and not being too set on, obviously, you want to get the data you want, but also being realistic, as you say, Mary. Like it's, as I also work as a general practitioner, and I know if I give someone 5 pieces of advice, they won't do it, or if I tell someone to do one exercise, they'll do it more than giving them 5 exercises. So I think it's the same thing with participants. You want to make sure you're being realistic with the time that it's going to take and the input it's going to take from the participant. So I think it's about sort of being, I think realistic is the real key.
Yeah, makes sense. And then I think, yeah, one more question here is, yeah, can you walk through the general time frame, even a range for general population study that is statistically significant? So I think your question is about like how long the study would take to conduct. I can maybe start, and then Matt, I don't know if you can share. I think we can share the sort of the timelines for the digest study, but assuming, kind of making some assumptions, assuming a few hundred patients, which is usually what we'd see to be able to detect a statistically significant difference between, say, a treatment group and a control group. So for consumer health studies, generally, we're able to go from having a agreed protocol to having a participant enrolled in about 8 weeks. And that includes, all the time for study setup, all of the kind of study documentation, participant materials, all of the kind of ethics committee, IRB approvals, sort of the US or most European geography. So all of that stuff, 8 weeks. And then to recruit those participants, it varies a little bit depending on the eligibility criteria, but for healthy volunteer populations, we usually look at about at least 100 participants, but at least 200 participants a month. The highest we've gone is about a couple hundred per week, but it really depends on some of the other factors in the study. So maybe very generally just saying like up to a month to enroll those participants. So we'd be looking at 2 months of setup, 1 month of participant enrollment for kind of a minimum viable sample for a statistically significant sample. And then you're following up those participants for as long as you need to. So yeah, hopefully that gives you some clarity, and very happy to give you like a more precise estimate if we can chat about the specific study design. But yeah.
I think you're right. So it depends what you're wanting to study and sort of what your observational time is. Our clinical trial time was 6 months, and then our intervention group were followed up for additional 12 months after that. So, and then after that is carried out, then obviously you have to think about your data analysis and things as well. So it really just depends on what it is and what endpoints you want to get and what your observational period is as well. And that'll really determine the duration that your trial will take.
Okay, I think that was the last question on the docket here. But if anyone has any other questions, please do write us an email, or you can just inquire via our website. But above all, thank you to everyone who joined, and thank you, Matt, and the whole Habitual team.
Thanks again, Mary. And so if anyone's got any queries about specifically, how Linda's helped with us at Habitual, you can reach out as well.
Cool. All right, awesome. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone.